afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the vicarage lawn in the village of St. Mary Mead, where the annual Harvest Festival garden party proceeded with the gentle rhythm of a well-rehearsed symphony. White marquees dotted the emerald grass like elegant mushrooms, their canvas sides fluttering in the mild September breeze. The scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the perfume of late-blooming roses, while the cheerful chatter of villagers created a pleasant backdrop to the quintessentially English scene. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting needles clicking with practiced precision as she worked on what appeared to be a baby's booty. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her 70-odd years, moved frequently from her work to observe the gentle chaos of village life unfolding before her. She had learned long ago that the most fascinating dramas often played out in the most ordinary settings, and today's gathering promised to be particularly revealing. The center of attention, as usual, was Mr. Reginald Postlethwaite, the village postman for the past 15 years. A robust man in his early 50s with a florid complexion and an unfortunate tendency toward indiscretion, Postlethwaite possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs gleaned from his daily rounds. He stood near the tombola stall, gesticulating enthusiastically as he regaled a small crowd with what appeared to be a particularly scandalous piece of gossip. "Mark my words," Postlethwaite declared, his voice carrying further than discretion would suggest. "There's more to that business at Greenways than meets the eye. Letters arriving at all hours, and from London solicitors no less." Miss Marple's knitting paused almost imperceptibly. Greenways was the elegant Georgian house recently purchased by Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, a seemingly respectable couple who had moved to St. Mary Mead 6 months prior. She had noticed the postman's particular interest in the Blackwoods' correspondence and his increasingly pointed comments about their affairs. Among Postlethwaite's audience stood several of the village's most prominent residents. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in a purple silk dress that had seen better decades, fanned herself with a church program while hanging on every word. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the postman's revelations, his weathered hands fidgeting with his pipe. Young Miss Weatherby from the lending library appeared torn between fascination and propriety. Her cheeks flushed pink as she glanced nervously toward the vicarage. "Really, Postlethwaite," Dr. Haydock interjected with obvious irritation, "a man's correspondence is his private affair. Your job is to deliver letters, not read them." The postman laughed heartily, seemingly oblivious to the doctor's disapproval. "Can't help what I see, can I, doctor? And when envelopes arrive marked urgent and confidential 3 times a week." He tapped his nose knowingly. "Well, it makes a fellow wonder, doesn't it?" Miss Marple observed the subtle reactions rippling through the group. Mrs. Bantry's fan moved more rapidly, while Miss Weatherby's blush deepened. Most interesting, however, was the expression that flickered across Dr. Haydock's face, something between anger and what might have been fear. The afternoon wore on with the comfortable predictability of such gatherings. The brass band played familiar hymns with more enthusiasm than skill. Children chased each other between the stalls with sticky fingers and grass-stained knees, and the ladies of the parish served endless cups of tea with the efficiency born of long practice. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, noting the way certain villagers seemed to gravitate toward or away from the still chattering postman, like iron filings responding to a magnet. As the church clock chimed 4, Postlethwaite made his way toward the refreshment tent, apparently in search of another cup of tea and a fresh audience for his stories. Miss Marple watched him navigate through the crowd, stopping to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Price Ridley and to ruffle young Tommy Bond's hair with paternal affection. For all his faults, the postman was genuinely fond of the village and its inhabitants, which made his indiscretions all the more troubling. It was Mrs. Bantry who found him. Her scream, when it came, was so piercing and unexpected that it seemed to freeze the entire gathering mid-motion. The brass band's rendition of Jerusalem faltered and died. Conversations ceased abruptly, and even the children stopped their games to stare in the direction of the commotion. "Oh, my dear God," Mrs. Bantry shrieked, her purple silk dress billowing as she stumbled backward from the refreshment tent. "Someone come quickly! It's Postlethwaite! He's... Dr. Haydock was the first to reach her, his medical training overriding any personal feelings about the postman's recent behavior. He pushed past the gathering crowd and disappeared into the tent, emerging moments later with his face grave and his hands trembling slightly as he lit his pipe with unsteady fingers. "I'm afraid," he announced to the hushed assembly, "that Mr. Postlethwaite has suffered what appears to be a fatal seizure. There's nothing to be done for him now." The garden party, which moments before had been a picture of rural tranquility, transformed instantly into a scene of shocked whispers and nervous speculation. Groups formed and reformed as people sought comfort in familiar faces, while others drifted toward the tent with the morbid curiosity that tragedy inevitably inspires. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting now forgotten in her lap as she observed the human drama unfolding before her. She noted the way Dr. Haydock avoided meeting anyone's eyes, the relief that seemed to wash over Miss Weatherby's features, and the calculating expression that briefly crossed Mrs. Price Ridley's face before settling into appropriate grief. Most interesting of all was the small detail that everyone else seemed to have overlooked. The delicate china teacup lying shattered beside Postlethwaite's body, its floral pattern now decorated with a few drops of what looked suspiciously unlike tea. In Miss Marple's long experience, when a man who knew too many secrets died suddenly at a village gathering, it was rarely as simple as natural causes. The postman who had spoken too much had finally, perhaps, said the wrong thing to the wrong person. As Constable Polk arrived to take charge of the scene and the villagers began their inevitable exodus, Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting and made her way home, her mind already turning over the various threads of motive, opportunity, and human nature that would need to be carefully untangled in the days to come. The Harvest Festival garden party was over, but for Miss Marple, the real investigation was just beginning. The lane from the vicarage sloped gently downward through hedges thick with late September brambles, and Miss Marple took her usual unhurried pace, her knitting bag light over her arm while her thoughts arranged themselves with characteristic precision. The afternoon's shocking conclusion had left the village in that peculiar state of agitation that follows unexpected death, where ordinary conversations take on heightened significance and every glance seems to carry hidden meaning. As she walked, two young girls cycled past in breathless excitement, their voices carrying on the evening air with the particular relish that the young reserve for dramatic events. "He went all blue," one declared with unseemly enthusiasm, while the other, noticing Miss Marple's approach, lowered her voice in a futile attempt at discretion that only made her words more audible. "They say he fell right into the teacups and scattered them everywhere." At the gate of the Bantry house, Dolly emerged as though she had been watching from behind her lace curtains, which she almost certainly had been. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of distress, with her silver hair slightly disheveled, and her hands fluttering nervously at the pearls around her neck. "My dear Jane," she called out, her voice carrying that particular note of excitement that tragedy brings to those who discover it. "Did you ever see such a thing? In our own refreshment tent, no less. I shall never be able to look at a tea service again without remembering that dreadful moment." Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, recognizing that Dolly's need to discuss the events was both genuine and potentially illuminating. "So very shocking for you, my dear," she said with gentle sympathy. "You were the one to find him, weren't you?" "Indeed I was, and I can tell you it was not a sight I shall soon forget." Dolly's voice dropped to what she imagined was a confidential whisper, though it carried perfectly well across the quiet lane. "He was lying there so still, Jane, with the strangest expression on his face. Not peaceful, as you might expect, but almost surprised. and there was tea spilled everywhere, with that pretty china cup lying in pieces beside him. Mrs. Archer will be beside herself about her best service. Miss Marple filed away this detail about the postman's expression while making appropriate sounds of sympathy. In her considerable experience, people who died of natural causes rarely looked surprised unless they had been anticipating something quite different from death. Dr. Haydock seemed rather shaken by it all, she observed mildly. Oh, he was indeed. Quite unlike his usual composed self. He examined poor Postlethwaite very briefly and pronounced it a seizure, but his hands were trembling when he lit his pipe afterward. Most unusual for a man who's seen as much death as he has. Dolly leaned closer, her eyes bright with the particular excitement that comes from being at the center of dramatic events. Between you and me, Jane, I don't think the doctor was entirely convinced by his own diagnosis. This observation aligned with Miss Marple's own impression of the physician's behavior. She had noticed the way Dr. Haydock avoided meeting anyone's eyes after emerging from the tent, and how he had departed the garden party with unusual haste. These sudden deaths can be very distressing for medical men, she said diplomatically. They feel responsible in a way, even when there's nothing they could have done. Perhaps, but there's something else, Jane. Something that's been troubling me all evening. Dolly glanced around as though expecting eavesdroppers to emerge from the hedgerows. You remember how animated Postlethwaite was yesterday morning when he delivered my letters? He was positively gleeful about something, hinting that he'd discovered some particularly juicy piece of gossip. He kept tapping that nose of his and saying it would set the cat among the pigeons when it came out. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their gentle clicking, paused almost imperceptibly. Did he give you any indication of what this information might concern? Not directly, but as he was leaving, he made the oddest comment. He turned back and said something about some folks thinking they can bury the past, but the post always finds its way through. I thought it was just one of his silly postal jokes. You know how he was always making puns about his work. But now, thinking back on it, Dolly's voice trailed off meaningfully. The implications of this revelation were not lost on Miss Marple. In her experience, when someone like Postlethwaite spoke of buried pasts and secrets finding their way to light, it usually meant he had stumbled across something genuinely damaging. The question was whether someone had decided to silence him before he could share his discovery more widely. There, conversation was interrupted by the approach of Miss Weatherby, who appeared to be returning from the village shop with her usual neat efficiency somewhat disrupted. Her typically immaculate hair showed signs of distraction, and her face bore the telltale marks of a sleepless night. She hesitated at the garden gate, clearly debating whether to join them or continue on her way, but Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic beckoning made retreat impossible. "Emily, dear, do come and join us," Mrs. Bantry called out. "Jane and I were just discussing poor Mr. Postlethwaite. Such a terrible shock for everyone." Miss Weatherby approached with obvious reluctance, her hands gripping her shopping basket with unnecessary force. "Yes, it was quite unexpected," she murmured, her voice carefully controlled. "One moment he was holding court by the tombola stall, the next—" She left the sentence unfinished, but Miss Marple noticed the way her knuckles had whitened around the basket handle. "You were standing quite close to him when he was discussing the Blackwoods correspondence," Miss Marple observed with gentle interest. "He seemed particularly animated about their postal arrangements." The effect of this seemingly innocent comment was remarkable. Miss Weatherby's carefully composed expression flickered, and a flush of color rose in her pale cheeks. Well, yes, he was always rather indiscreet about such matters. It wasn't proper, really, discussing people's private affairs in such a public way." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with renewed interest, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. "But surely there's no real harm in noticing when letters arrive from London solicitors? The Blackwoods are newcomers, after all. It's only natural that people would be curious." "Natural, perhaps," Miss Weatherby replied with unexpected sharpness, "but not necessarily wise. Some curiosity can lead to complications that are better avoided. Miss Marple tucked this intriguing response away for future consideration. In her experience, librarians were among the most observant members of any community, privy to reading habits and research requests that often revealed more about people's concerns than they might wish known. If Miss Weatherby was worried about complications arising from curiosity about the Black Woods, it suggested she might possess knowledge about what those complications could entail. The sound of purposeful footsteps announced another arrival, and Miss Marple looked up to see Dr. Haydock approaching with his characteristic brisk stride, though today there seemed to be something forced about his usual confidence. His weathered face bore the drawn expression of a man who had spent the night wrestling with uncomfortable thoughts, and his usually steady hands showed a slight tremor as he removed his hat. "Ladies," he greeted them with automatic courtesy, though his voice carried an undercurrent of tension. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt it necessary to speak with you about yesterday's unfortunate events." Mrs. Bantry immediately offered refreshment, which he declined with a distracted wave. "I've just come from the police station," he continued, his professional demeanor not quite concealing his unease. "Inspector Slack will be arriving from the county headquarters this afternoon to conduct a more thorough investigation into Mr. Postlethwaite's death." The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Miss Weatherby carefully set down her shopping basket, while Mrs. Bantry's mouth formed a perfect circle of surprise and concern. "Investigation," Mrs. Bantry finally managed to say, "but surely it was simply a heart attack or stroke. These things do happen, particularly to men of his age and robust habits." Dr. Haydock's expression grew even more grave, and Miss Marple noticed how he avoided meeting anyone's eyes directly. "I'm afraid the preliminary examination has raised certain questions that require official attention. Without compromising medical confidentiality, I can say that some aspects of Mr. Postlethwaite's condition were not entirely consistent with natural causes." Miss Marple's knitting needles had stilled completely, though her expression remained as placidly interested as ever. "What sort of questions might those be, Doctor?" The physician hesitated, clearly struggling between professional discretion and the need to prepare the community for what was coming. "Inspector Slack will need to speak with everyone who was present at the garden party, particularly those who had any contact with the deceased during his final hours. I would advise everyone to think carefully about their interactions with Mr. Postlethwaite yesterday afternoon." The implications settled over the small group like a cold fog. Miss Weatherby had gone quite pale, while Mrs. Bantry's eyes darted between her companions as if seeking reassurance that this was all some sort of dreadful misunderstanding. "You mean to say," Mrs. Bantry whispered, "that someone might have actually—" "I mean to say," Dr. Haydock replied with careful precision, "that we must all be prepared to assist the authorities in determining exactly what happened. The sooner this matter is resolved, the better for everyone concerned." As the doctor took his leave with obvious relief, Miss Marple reflected on the interesting fact that he had felt compelled to visit them personally to deliver this news. In her experience, when medical professionals took such unusual steps, it often meant they harbored concerns that extended well beyond their official duties. The question was whether Dr. Haydock was worried about what the investigation might discover, or whether he was attempting to protect someone from what those discoveries might reveal. The evening air had grown cooler as the three women finally parted company, each lost in her own thoughts about the day's revelations. Miss Marple made her way home through the familiar lanes, noting how the village seemed to have acquired a different quality in the fading light. Windows that usually glowed with warm, welcoming light now seemed to harbor shadows, and the ordinary sounds of evening took on a more ominous character. In her sitting room, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of chintz cushions and carefully tended plants, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair and took up her knitting once more. The pattern required attention to detail, much like the puzzle that was beginning to form around poor Mr. Postlethwaite's untimely death. She thought about Mrs. Archer, who would have been responsible for the tea service, and her helpful niece Hilda, who had been assisting with the refreshments. There was also the matter of the cordial bottle that Mrs. Archer sometimes kept under the tea table for the children, a sweet, syrupy substance that could easily mask other flavors. As her needles clicked in their steady rhythm, Miss Marple considered the various threads of motive and opportunity that were beginning to emerge. Someone in that peaceful garden party gathering had decided that Mr. Postlethwaite's indiscretions had gone too far, and they had acted with the kind of desperate efficiency that spoke of genuine fear rather than mere annoyance. The challenge now would be to identify which of the village's seemingly respectable residents harbored secrets dark enough to drive them to murder, and clever enough to nearly make it appear natural. Tomorrow would bring Inspector Slack and his official investigation, but tonight belonged to quiet reflection and the careful consideration of human nature in all its complexity. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most shocking crimes often sprang from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the key to solving them lay not in dramatic revelations, but in patient observation of the small, telling details that revealed the truth about people's hearts. The morning brought with it a peculiar quality of light that seemed to drain the color from St. Mary Mead's usually cheerful cottages, leaving them looking pale and somehow insubstantial against the gray September sky. Miss Marple, rising earlier than her usual custom, noted how the village had acquired that particular atmosphere of suppressed excitement that follows shocking events when ordinary routines continue, but with an undercurrent of tension that makes every encounter potentially significant. From her bedroom window, she observed Mrs. Price Ridley hurrying past with her gaze fixed firmly on the pavement, while across the lane the baker's boy stood in animated conversation with Mr. Clement from the garage, their voices carrying just far enough to suggest urgent discussion without revealing actual words. The sound of a motor car approaching with official purpose drew her attention to the lane, where Inspector Slack's police vehicle made its determined way toward the village center. The inspector himself proved to be a compact man with an impatient manner and a heavy tread, who stepped from his car with the air of one who finds villagers and their sensibilities inconvenient to police work. Miss Marple, who had encountered the inspector on previous occasions, recognized his tendency to pursue the most obvious solution with admirable persistence, though sometimes lacking the subtlety required to understand the more complex motivations that drove people to desperate acts. By 9:30, the vicarage lawn had been transformed into the center of official investigation. Inspector Slack examined the collapsed marquee in the area around the refreshment tent with methodical thoroughness, while Constable Polk took notes and attempted to keep curious villagers at a respectful distance. Miss Marple, who had no intention of being in anyone's way, happened to be tending her roses along the front path when Mrs. Bantry materialized at her gate with the breathless urgency of someone bearing significant news. "They've gone straight to examining everything," Mrs. Bantry reported, her pearls clicking softly as she gestured toward the vicarage. "Inspector Slack is tramping about as if he's investigating a battlefield rather than a church garden party. I told Constable Polk to be careful with Mrs. Archer's embroidered tablecloth, but you know how men are with such things." Their observation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Archer herself, who appeared with the particular expression of barely contained distress that indicated urgent need for conversation. The woman who had organized the refreshment arrangements looked as though she had spent a sleepless night wrestling with troubling thoughts, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of hasty preparation. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Archer began without preamble, "I simply must speak with someone sensible about what happened yesterday. There's something that's been weighing on my mind, something I didn't mention in all the confusion." She paused, gathering courage for her revelation. "One of my elderflower cordial bottles went missing during the party. I had prepared 3 bottles specially for the children's refreshments, but when I went to serve them around 3 o'clock, there were only 2. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly as she absorbed this information. Elderflower cordial, with its distinctive sweet flavor, would be an ideal substance for masking other tastes. When did you first notice it was missing? That's just it. I'm quite certain all 3 bottles were there when I set up the refreshments at 1:30. I remember arranging them carefully under the serving table, but by 3 o'clock, one had simply vanished. Mrs. Archer's voice dropped to a whisper, and when poor Mr. Postlethwaite was found, there was a sticky residue around his mouth that looked very much like elderflower cordial. Inspector Slack's voice carried across the lawn as he questioned the various witnesses, his direct manner causing visible discomfort among the villagers. When he summoned Mrs. Archer for her formal statement, she reluctantly joined the procession to the refreshment tent, where the inspector was examining the remnants of yesterday's arrangements with professional scrutiny. Mrs. Archer says the deceased helped himself to tea, Slack announced to the small gathering that had formed. Claims she was busy with change for the scones and told him to serve himself. Not ideal from an investigative standpoint. Miss Marple's attention had come to rest upon several details that others seemed to overlook. A bowl of sugar that remained on the serving table, its curved sides filmed with a stickiness that caught the light differently from mere tea residue. A stack of saucers that was incomplete by one piece, and near the collapsed corner of the marquee, a faint stain in the grass where bees fussed industriously at something that was a shade deeper than tea and slightly too ruby to be explained by overboiled leaves. The parade of witnesses began with Mrs. Archer's niece Hilda, a pale and earnest young woman who twisted her apron nervously as she recounted the events. Mr. Postlethwaite asked for a second cup, she explained, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the inspector's shoulder. He said the first was too weak. I was serving Mrs. Price Ridley at the time, so I told him the teapot was there and he could help himself. I was about to bring out more sugar as the bowl was nearly empty. And who else was near the tea service at that time? Slack inquired, making notes with mechanical precision. Mrs. Blackwood came in just as he was pouring his second cup. She asked for cool water, said the heat in the tent was excessive. I went to fetch it from the kitchen, and when I returned, Mr. Postlethwaite was standing with his cup, talking to her. She seemed not to wish to be engaged in conversation. This testimony prompted Slack to summon the Blackwoods, who arrived with the careful composure of people accustomed to managing difficult situations. Mrs. Blackwood, elegant in her London clothes, maintained that she had requested water, exchanged minimal pleasantries with the postman, and departed when her request could not be immediately fulfilled. Her husband confirmed he had been at the Skittles during the relevant period, though Miss Marple noted that neither of them inquired about the cause of death, which struck her as rather unusual. The morning's revelations took a more intriguing turn when young Daisy Rudkin from the post office approached Miss Marple with the air of a child confessing to forbidden knowledge. "It's about a letter, miss," she began nervously. Mr. Postlethwaite was in such a state about it. A registered letter for the Blackwoods that had gone missing for a whole week. He was terrified of losing his position over it. Miss Marple encouraged the girl with gentle patience, recognizing that this information might prove significant. "Did he eventually locate this letter?" "Oh, yes, miss. Yesterday morning he came in waving it like a trophy, all tied up with string because the clasp on his pouch had broken. He was ever so pleased with himself. Said it would be delivered that afternoon without fail." Daisy's voice dropped to a whisper. "But here's what's strange. I saw Mr. Blackwood after what happened, talking to Mr. Cargill from the bank. He said something about the damned post, begging your pardon, and how if people did their jobs properly, other people wouldn't come to grief." This revelation added another layer to the growing complexity of the case. Miss Marple reflected that a registered letter, missing for a week and suddenly recovered on the day of the postman's death, suggested more than mere postal inefficiency. Her contemplation was interrupted by Miss Weatherby, who appeared with obvious reluctance and the strained expression of someone carrying burdensome knowledge. "Miss Marple," she began formally, "I find myself in need of advice. Inspector Slack has requested my presence at the police station this afternoon, and I'm afraid I possess information that could be misinterpreted." The librarian's revelation proved startling. 3 days before the garden party, Mr. Postlethwaite had visited the lending library with an unusual research request. He'd spent nearly 2 hours examining property records and legal documents related to recent house purchases in the village, with particular attention to the Blackwoods' acquisition of greenways. Most significantly, he had inquired about procedures for verifying identities and detecting assumed names. He was quite excited about something he'd discovered, Miss Weatherby continued nervously. He kept muttering about paper trails and things that don't add up. Just before he left, he made copies of several documents and said he had enough evidence to make things very interesting indeed. As the afternoon progressed, Dr. Haydock sought a private word with Miss Marple, requesting her presence at his surgery for what he termed a matter of professional conscience. In his consulting room, surrounded by the familiar implements of his trade, he poured tea with hands that showed a slight tremor. "I wanted to be entirely frank with you," he began without preamble. "I found traces of something on the cup fragments, a suggestion of bitterness that was not consistent with ordinary tea. Not conclusive evidence, you understand, merely an impression when I tested a dampened splinter." He touched his mouth briefly, as if ashamed of his unorthodox method. "I cannot state definitively what substance was present, only that the tea was not, in my professional judgment, simple tea." Miss Marple absorbed this confirmation of her growing suspicions while considering the various elements that were beginning to form a pattern. The missing elderflower, cordial, the registered letter that had disappeared and reappeared, the postman's research into identity verification, and now medical evidence suggesting the presence of foreign substances in his final cup of tea. As evening approached and the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations from the comfort of her sitting room. The investigation had moved from shock into substance, revealing a complex web of secrets, research, and carefully planned deception. Someone among the garden party guests had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to silence Mr. Postlethwaite before he could share whatever damaging information he had discovered. The challenge now would be to determine which of the village's seemingly respectable residents harbored secrets dark enough to drive them to murder, and clever enough to nearly disguise it as natural death. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though several pieces remained to be fitted into place. Tomorrow would bring new developments, but tonight belonged to quiet contemplation of human nature in all its complexity, and the careful consideration of how ordinary people could be driven to extraordinary acts when their carefully constructed lives were threatened with exposure. The morning brought with it that peculiar quality of suppressed excitement that follows dramatic events in small communities, where ordinary routines continue but with an undercurrent of watchfulness that transforms even the most innocent encounters into potential sources of revelation. Miss Marple, rising earlier than her usual custom, observed from her bedroom window how the village had acquired a different rhythm, with residents moving about their business while maintaining that heightened awareness that comes when familiar surroundings have been touched by violence. Inspector Slack's motor car arrived at the vicarage with official punctuality, and by 9:30 he had established his methodical examination of the previous day's events. Miss Marple, who had no intention of interfering with police business, found herself at the post office ostensibly to purchase stamps, though her true interest lay in observing how the investigation was affecting the village's normal patterns of behavior. Young Daisy Rudkin stood behind the counter with the particular expression of someone carrying burdensome knowledge, her hands trembling slightly as she sorted the morning's correspondence. When Miss Marple inquired gently about the registered letter that had caused such concern, Daisy's response revealed details that cast the postman's death in an even more troubling light. "The thing is, Miss Marple," Daisy whispered, glancing nervously toward the door, "when Mr. Postlethwaite finally found that letter again, he was ever so excited because someone had tampered with it. The wax seal had been broken and resealed, but not very skillfully. He said anyone with experience could tell it had been opened." She paused, gathering courage for her next revelation. And he was carrying it in his leather pouch yesterday, tied with string because the clasp was broken. But Inspector Slack says no pouch was found on him, and it's not in the vicarage cloakroom where he usually left his bag. This information added a crucial dimension to the mystery. A missing postal pouch containing evidence of intercepted correspondence suggested that someone had taken considerable risk to remove it from the scene. Miss Marple reflected that such desperate measures indicated the presence of secrets far more serious than mere social embarrassment. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who appeared with the grave expression of a man bearing unwelcome news. His usually steady demeanor showed signs of the strain that comes from wrestling with professional obligations and personal concerns. "I've just come from consulting with Inspector Slack," he announced without preamble. "The preliminary examination has confirmed what I suspected yesterday. Mr. Postlethwaite died from digitalis poisoning, administered in sufficient quantity to cause rapid cardiac arrest." He paused, his weathered hands fidgeting with his medical bag. "Someone with considerable knowledge prepared this poison, Miss Marple. The dosage was precisely calculated to kill quickly while mimicking natural heart failure." Miss Marple absorbed this confirmation of her growing suspicions while considering the implications. Digitalis, derived from common foxglove plants, would indeed be available to anyone with botanical knowledge, but its proper preparation and dosage required either medical training or careful research. "There's something else," Dr. Haydock continued reluctantly. "A bottle of digitalis tincture went missing from my surgery last week. I've reported this to Inspector Slack, though I cannot definitively say when it disappeared or who might have taken it." His expression grew even more troubled. "The timing is highly suspicious, given subsequent events." The morning's revelations took a more personal turn when Mrs. Bantry arrived, with information that shed new light on the Blackwood's mysterious background. Her London cousin, she reported breathlessly, had made discreet inquiries among her social connections and discovered troubling inconsistencies in the couple's claimed history. According to Mildred's investigations, Mrs. Bantry explained with barely contained excitement, no couple named Blackwood purchased property in Surrey during the past year, and the London address they provided as their previous residence is occupied by an entirely different family. Most significantly, the bank they claim to use has no record of accounts under that name. This revelation provided compelling evidence that the Blackwoods were indeed living under assumed identities, which would explain both their secretive behavior and Postlethwaite's suspicious interest in their correspondence. Miss Marple noted, however, that while false identities provided motive for silencing an inquisitive postman, they did not necessarily indicate guilt of murder. The investigation's focus shifted decisively when Miss Weatherby arrived at Miss Marple's cottage in a state of considerable agitation. The librarian's usual composed demeanor had given way to obvious distress as she revealed another crucial piece of information about the postman's research activities. After examining the property records, Miss Weatherby explained nervously, "Mr. Postlethwaite asked to see our collection of London telephone directories. He spent nearly an hour copying addresses and telephone numbers for legal firms and private investigation services." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I believe he was planning to verify his suspicions about the Blackwoods through professional channels." This testimony suggested that Postlethwaite had been conducting a far more thorough investigation than anyone had realized. If he had been contacting London solicitors and private investigators, he might have gathered substantial evidence about the couple's true identities and the reasons for their deception. The afternoon brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage with the satisfied air of a man who believes he has solved his case. His usually brusque manner carried an undertone of triumph as he outlined his conclusions about the Blackwoods' guilt. "The evidence is quite clear," he announced with characteristic directness. "False identities, intercepted correspondence, the victim's investigation into their background, and now the systematic removal of evidence from both the crime scene and the library. The Blackwoods had compelling motive to silence Postlethwaite before he could expose their deception." Miss Marple continued her knitting while considering the inspector's reasoning. The case against the Blackwoods was indeed compelling, built upon a foundation of suspicious circumstances and apparent motive. Yet something about the neat alignment of evidence troubled her experienced instincts. "And the method of administration?" she inquired mildly. "The missing elderflower cordial bottle and the empty sugar bowl provide the answer," Slack replied confidently. "Someone prepared a poisoned sugar lump, knowing Postlethwaite's habit of taking 2 lumps in his tea. When he returned for his second cup and served himself, he unknowingly consumed the fatal dose." The inspector's satisfaction was evident as he outlined how the Blackwoods had possessed both opportunity and means. Mrs. Blackwood had been present in the refreshment tent when Postlethwaite poured his second cup, while her husband's alibi at the Skittles game was hardly conclusive, given the brief time required to administer poison. As Inspector Slack departed with obvious confidence in his solution, Miss Marple reflected on the curious perfection of the case he had constructed. In her considerable experience, when evidence aligned too neatly with obvious suspects, it often indicated either remarkable coincidence or careful manipulation by someone hoping to direct suspicion away from themselves. The missing postal pouch particularly troubled her thoughts. Someone had taken considerable risk to remove it from the scene, suggesting they feared what it might reveal. Yet if the Blackwoods were indeed guilty, why would they need to steal evidence of their victim's investigation when his death would presumably end any threat of exposure? Evening brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Archer's niece Hilda, who appeared with the nervous determination of someone who had been wrestling with troubling thoughts. Her revelation about the sugar bowl's condition added another layer to the growing complexity of the case. "When I cleared the refreshment table," Hilda explained quietly, "the sugar bowl was not just empty but completely clean, as if someone had washed it thoroughly, and there was a matching saucer missing from the tea service, one that belonged with the cup that was found broken beside Mr. Postlethwaite." Miss Marple found these details particularly significant. Someone had taken considerable care to remove all traces of their preparation, suggesting both premeditation and an understanding of what evidence might be revealing. The missing saucer implied that the poison had been prepared elsewhere and brought to the scene, rather than mixed spontaneously in the sugar bowl. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her comfortable sitting room considering the various threads of evidence and motive that had emerged during the day's investigation. The case against the Blackwoods was compelling but perhaps too convenient, built upon assumptions about their guilt that might blind observers to other possibilities. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful to investigations, providing just enough information to direct suspicion toward convenient targets while concealing their own involvement. Someone in the village possessed both the knowledge to prepare digitalis poison and the cleverness to frame the obvious suspects, and tomorrow's developments would require careful attention to the subtle signs that revealed the difference between genuine evidence and skillful misdirection. The postman who had spoken too much had indeed discovered dangerous secrets, but the question remained whether those secrets belonged to the mysterious Blackwoods or to someone else entirely. Someone who had used the couple's suspicious circumstances as the perfect cover for murder. The morning brought with it that peculiar quality of suppressed anticipation that follows shocking revelations in small communities, where the ordinary business of daily life continues beneath an undercurrent of watchful tension. Miss Marple, rising earlier than her customary hour, observed from her bedroom window how the village had acquired a different rhythm, with residents moving about their morning routines while maintaining that heightened awareness that comes when familiar surroundings have been touched by violence and deception. Inspector Slack's motor car remained prominently positioned outside the village hall, which had been commandeered as a temporary police headquarters, and by 9:30 a steady stream of villagers had been summoned for additional questioning. The Blackwoods, maintaining their careful composure despite obvious strain, had been among the first to arrive. their London elegance somehow diminished by the circumstances, yet still intact enough to set them apart from their rural neighbours. Miss Marple, who had no intention of interfering with official proceedings, found herself at the baker's shop ostensibly to purchase her weekly order, though her true interest lay in observing how the investigation's developments were affecting the village's normal patterns of social interaction. The baker's wife, Mrs. Jameson, proved eager to discuss the morning's dramatic events with the particular relish that shocking news brings to those who discover themselves at its periphery. "They've had the Blackwoods in there for nearly 2 hours," Mrs. Jameson reported with barely contained excitement, her flour-dusted hands gesturing toward the village hall. "Inspector Slack seems convinced he's got his murderers, though I must say they don't look the type for poison. Too refined, if you ask me. Poison's a sneaky business, requires local knowledge." This observation struck Miss Marple as particularly astute. In her considerable experience, the method of murder often revealed as much about the perpetrator as the motive itself, and the precise preparation of digitalis suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both botanical and medical properties. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Archer, who appeared with the determined expression of someone who had spent a sleepless night wrestling with troubling memories. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of distress, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached Miss Marple with obvious urgency. "Miss Marple, I simply must speak with you about something that's been weighing on my conscience," Mrs. Archer began without preamble. "Yesterday, when I was clearing the refreshment table after all the commotion, I noticed something quite extraordinary that I failed to mention in all the confusion." She paused, gathering courage for her revelation. The sugar bowl, which Hilda had confirmed was nearly empty, contained a single brown sugar lump that hadn't been there before. A large, old-fashioned piece, quite sticky to the touch, nothing like the white granulated sugar I had provided for the tea service. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their gentle rhythm, paused almost imperceptibly as she absorbed this crucial information. A brown sugar lump, distinctive and out of place, would be an ideal vehicle for disguising the bitter taste of digitalis while ensuring the victim received a concentrated dose, regardless of his normal sugar consumption habits. "Did you recognize this particular type of sugar lump?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle interest. "That's what troubles me so," Mrs. Archer replied nervously. "It looked exactly like the old-fashioned brown lumps that Dr. Haydock keeps in his surgery for his diabetic patients who need quick sugar. He's mentioned them before when discussing medical emergencies. They're quite distinctive, much larger than ordinary lumps and treated with something to make them dissolve slowly." This revelation cast the entire investigation in a dramatically different light. If Dr. Haydock's medical sugar lumps had been used as the delivery method for the poison, it suggested not only access to specialized materials, but intimate knowledge of their properties and availability. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Finch, Mr. Postlethwaite's landlady, who had clearly been seeking an opportunity to share information that had been troubling her thoughts. Her revelation about the postman's recent habits proved equally significant to the developing picture of the crime. "The thing that's been bothering me all night," Mrs. Finch explained earnestly, "is something about poor Mr. Postlethwaite's tea drinking. Everyone keeps saying he always took 2 lumps of sugar, but that hasn't been true for months now. Dr. Haydock advised him to reduce his sugar intake because of stomach troubles, and lately he'd been taking only 1 lump. Sometimes none at all. He still said 2 for luck out of habit, but I never saw him actually take 2 these past months." Miss Marple found this testimony particularly illuminating. If the murderer had planned their attack based on the assumption that Postlethwaite would consume 2 poisoned sugar lumps, they would have been working with outdated information. A more reliable method would be to ensure the poison was delivered through a single, concentrated source that would be fatal, regardless of the victim's actual consumption habits. The morning's revelations continued when young Hilda appeared with the nervous determination of someone who had been wrestling with guilty knowledge. Her connection to Dr. Haydock's surgery, revealed through her cleaning duties, added another troubling dimension to the accumulating evidence. "I clean the surgery twice a week," Hilda confessed reluctantly, her hands twisting her apron nervously. "Dr. Haydock keeps his medical supplies in a locked cabinet, but the key is always in the same place for emergencies. Last Thursday, when I was dusting, I noticed the digitalis bottle was nearly empty, though it had been full the week before." She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And yesterday morning, before the garden party, I saw him in his garden gathering foxglove flowers. When I asked if they were for pressing, he became quite agitated and said something about disposing of dangerous plants before someone got hurt." Miss Marple reflected on the significance of this timing. Dr. Haydock's gathering of fresh foxglove flowers on the morning of the murder, combined with his missing digitalis tincture and the appearance of his distinctive medical sugar lumps at the crime scene, created a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The afternoon brought an unexpected encounter with Mr. Clement from the garage, who approached Miss Marple with the troubled expression of someone who had been debating whether to share potentially damaging information. His revelation about a recent confrontation between Dr. Haydock and the postman provided crucial insight into the motive behind the crime. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Mr. Clement explained reluctantly, "but Tuesday afternoon I witnessed quite a heated argument between Dr. Haydock and Postlethwaite outside the surgery. The postman was waving a letter about, saying something about misdirected mail and people who think they're above the law. Dr. Haydock looked absolutely furious, kept trying to snatch the letter away, finally told Postlethwaite that some things were better left alone if he knew what was good for him. This testimony suggested that Postlethwaite's investigation had extended beyond the Blackwood's false identities to encompass other village secrets, possibly involving the respected physician. If the postman had discovered evidence of medical malpractice or illegal activities involving Dr. Haydock, it would provide compelling motive for murder by someone who stood to lose not only reputation, but professional standing and freedom. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her comfortable sitting room considering the various threads of evidence that had emerged throughout the day. The case against the Blackwoods, while superficially compelling, was built primarily on their suspicious circumstances and assumed identities rather than concrete evidence of guilt. In contrast, the accumulating testimony about Dr. Haydock revealed both means, motive, and opportunity for the crime. The missing digitalis tincture, the distinctive brown sugar lumps, the gathering of fresh foxglove flowers, and the heated confrontation with the victim created a pattern that suggested careful premeditation by someone with intimate medical knowledge. Most significantly, the use of Dr. Haydock's own medical supplies as the murder weapon indicated either remarkable coincidence or deliberate exploitation of his trusted position in the community. Miss Marple reflected on the psychology of the crime, recognizing the particular arrogance that would drive someone to use their own distinctive materials while attempting to frame convenient suspects. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed their professional standing made them above suspicion, leading them to take risks that ultimately revealed their guilt. The postman who had spoken too much had indeed discovered dangerous secrets, but those secrets appeared to belong not to desperate fugitives from financial ruin, but to someone whose medical knowledge had been turned to deadly purpose. The challenge now would be to gather sufficient evidence to convince Inspector Slack to look beyond the obvious suspects he was so eager to charge, and to do so before the true murderer realized that their carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. Tomorrow would require delicate maneuvering to expose the truth without alerting the real killer to the growing suspicion of their guilt, for in Miss Marple's experience, cornered criminals often proved most dangerous when they believed their carefully laid plans were about to be exposed. The morning brought with it that peculiar quality of forced normalcy that follows shocking revelations in small communities where ordinary routines continue but with an underlying tension that transforms every encounter into a potential source of further revelation. Miss Marple, rising earlier than her customary hour, observed from her bedroom window how the village had acquired a different quality in the pale September light, with residents moving about their morning business while maintaining that heightened awareness that comes when familiar surroundings have been touched by both violence and the gradual unraveling of long-held secrets. Inspector Slack's motor car remained positioned outside the village hall with official persistence, though Miss Marple noted with interest that his investigation seemed to have reached a curious impasse. The Blackwoods, despite their deceptive identities and suspicious circumstances, had proven frustratingly lacking in concrete evidence connecting them to the actual method of murder. Meanwhile, the accumulating testimony about Dr. Haydock's behavior and access to the murder weapon created a pattern that demanded careful consideration. Miss Marple's morning walk took her past the lending library, where she encountered young Daisy Rudkin from the post office, in a state of considerable agitation. The girl's discovery, made during her morning cleaning duties, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle that was slowly revealing the true complexity of the crime. "Miss Marple," Daisy whispered urgently, glancing around to ensure they were unobserved, "I found something hidden in the storage room behind the old sorting boxes. Mr. Postlethwaite's leather pouch, the one everyone's been looking for." She opened her canvas bag with trembling hands to reveal not only the missing postal pouch, but its contents, which proved far more damaging than anyone had anticipated. The registered letter that had caused such concern was indeed present, its broken wax seal crudely repaired with ordinary candle wax, rather than proper postal seal. More significantly, however, the pouch contained copies of correspondence that Postlethwaite had apparently intercepted and photographed using the library's copying equipment. Miss Marple examined these documents with growing understanding of the motive that had driven someone to murder. The correspondence revealed a pattern of investigation into Dr. Haydock's prescribing practices, with particular concern about his distribution of controlled substances and his treatment of certain wealthy patients who had died under circumstances that warranted official scrutiny. One letter, dated just 2 weeks prior to the garden party, formally notified him of an impending investigation by the General Medical Council and requested his immediate response to allegations of professional misconduct that could result in criminal charges. Mr. Postlethwaite was beside himself when he realized what he'd stumbled across, Daisy explained nervously. He said it wasn't right. Doctors taking advantage of sick people just because they had money to pay for special treatments. He was determined that the authorities should know what was happening, even if it meant making enemies in the village. This revelation cast the postman's death in an entirely different light. Rather than being killed to protect false identities or financial secrets, he had been murdered to prevent the exposure of medical malpractice that could have resulted in imprisonment and the complete destruction of Dr. Haydock's career and reputation. Miss Marple's contemplation of these developments was interrupted by an unexpected encounter with young Tommy Bond, who approached her with the particular pride that children reserve for their most treasured discoveries. In his grubby hands, he clutched a narrow-necked glass bottle that he had retrieved from the vicarage pond during his morning fishing expedition. "Found it in the reeds, Miss Marple," Tommy announced with satisfaction. "Thought it might be treasure, but it's just an old bottle. Smells funny, though." Miss Marple examined the bottle with careful attention, noting the faint scent of elderflower that still clung to its interior despite its soaking in pond water. The sticky residue around the neck and the absence of any original label suggested this was indeed the missing elderflower cordial bottle that Mrs. Archer had reported. More significantly, the bottle's location in the pond indicated that someone had disposed of it hastily, throwing it from the vicarage lawn, where it would eventually sink into the muddy bottom among the reeds. "A very interesting discovery, Tommy," Miss Marple said gently, offering the boy a coin for his trouble. "You've been most helpful to a curious old lady." As Tommy departed with his reward, Miss Marple reflected on the significance of this physical evidence. The elderflower bottle's presence in the pond, combined with the missing brown sugar lump and the intercepted medical correspondence, created a pattern that pointed unmistakably towards someone with both medical knowledge and intimate familiarity with the vicarage grounds during the garden party. Her morning's investigations continued when she encountered Mrs. Weatherby outside the chemist's shop, where the librarian's revelation about missing carbon paper provided another piece of the puzzle. Someone had taken considerable risk to remove even the faintest traces of what Postlethwaite had been copying, suggesting both desperation and an understanding of how thorough investigations could uncover seemingly insignificant evidence. The carbon paper disappeared sometime after closing on Tuesday, Mrs. Weatherby explained nervously. Someone had been through my desk quite thoroughly, though they tried to make it appear undisturbed. It gave me such a horrid feeling, knowing that someone had been searching through my things while I slept. Miss Marple found this testimony particularly significant, because it indicated that the murderer had not acted impulsively, but had planned carefully to remove all traces of Postlethwaite's investigation. The theft of carbon paper, the missing postal pouch, and the disposal of the elderflower bottle demonstrated a methodical approach to eliminating evidence. The afternoon brought Dr. Haydock himself to Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly for a routine medical inquiry, but clearly driven by more pressing concerns. His usually confident demeanor showed unmistakable signs of strain, and his hands trembled slightly as he declined her offer of tea with what seemed like genuine nervousness rather than mere politeness. "I wanted to discuss the investigation with someone of sense," he began without his usual preliminary courtesies. "Inspector Slack seems determined to charge the Blackwoods despite the lack of concrete evidence connecting them to the actual method of murder. I fear he's allowing their suspicious circumstances to cloud his judgment about the medical aspects of the case." Miss Marple continued her knitting while observing the physician's behavior with the careful attention she reserved for moments of particular significance. She noted how his explanation of digitalis poisoning demonstrated intimate knowledge of the poison's properties while ostensibly arguing for the Blackwoods' innocence, and how his visit seemed designed more to gauge what she might know than to offer genuine assistance to the investigation. "The digitalis poisoning does seem to require specialized knowledge," she agreed mildly. "Not the sort of thing one could accomplish without understanding proper dosages and preparation methods." "Precisely my point," Dr. Haydock replied with perhaps too much enthusiasm. "Digitalis is extremely dangerous in the wrong hands, requiring precise calculation based on the victim's weight, general health, and tolerance levels. Someone with medical training would understand these considerations, but ordinary villagers would have no idea how to prepare such a poison safely." The irony of the physician's own words seemed lost on him as he continued to outline exactly why the murder required medical expertise. Miss Marple noted how his detailed explanation revealed not only professional knowledge, but the particular kind of intimate familiarity that comes from actual experience rather than theoretical understanding. As Dr. Haydock departed with obvious relief at having shared his concerns, Miss Marple reflected on the psychology of his visit. In her considerable experience, guilty parties often felt compelled to insert themselves into investigations, offering helpful theories that directed suspicion away from themselves while demonstrating their apparent cooperation with authorities. The doctor's eagerness to discuss the technical aspects of the poisoning, combined with his obvious nervousness about the investigation's direction, suggested someone who was deeply concerned about what might be discovered. Evening brought Mrs. Archer and her niece Hilda to Miss Marple's cottage, both women bearing the determined expression of people who had reached difficult decisions about their civic responsibilities. Their revelation about the distinctive brown sugar lump provided crucial confirmation of the evidence that had been accumulating throughout the day. "I've been wrestling with my conscience," Mrs. Archer announced without preamble. "That brown sugar lump I found in the tea service was not ordinary sugar. When I touched it, my fingers became numb for several minutes afterward, and there was a bitter aftertaste that lingered despite washing my hands thoroughly." Hilda's contribution proved equally significant. Dr. Haydock keeps those special medical sugar lumps in a locked drawer in his consultation room for diabetic emergencies. I've seen him prepare them when I clean the surgery twice a week. He soaks them in various solutions depending on what the patient needs. If someone wanted to disguise poison in sugar, those lumps would be perfect because they're designed to dissolve slowly and deliver concentrated doses of medication. Miss Marple absorbed this testimony while considering the full implications of Dr. Haydock's calculated method. By using his own distinctive medical supplies as the murder weapon, he demonstrated the particular arrogance that often proved the downfall of intelligent criminals who believed their professional standing made them above suspicion. The evidence was now overwhelming. The missing digitalis tincture, the distinctive medical sugar lumps, the intercepted correspondence revealing his professional misconduct and his intimate knowledge of poison preparation and dosage calculation. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her comfortable sitting room considering how best to present this evidence to Inspector Slack without alerting Dr. Haydock to the growing suspicion of his guilt. The challenge would be to arrange a confrontation that would force the physician to reveal his guilt through his own actions, for, in her experience, the most convincing evidence often came from the criminal's own desperate attempts to maintain their deception when faced with the possibility of exposure. The postman who had spoken too much had indeed discovered dangerous secrets, but those secrets belonged not to desperate fugitives from financial ruin, but to someone whose trusted position in the community had provided the perfect cover for both medical malpractice and murder. Tomorrow would require careful orchestration to bring the investigation to its proper conclusion, ensuring that justice was served while protecting the village from a man whose medical knowledge had been perverted to deadly purpose. The morning brought with it that peculiar quality of false resolution that follows hasty conclusions, where official satisfaction masks the deeper currents of truth that continue to flow beneath the surface of apparent certainty. Miss Marple, rising with her customary punctuality despite the weight of her accumulated knowledge, observed from her bedroom window how the village had acquired a different quality in the pale September light, with Inspector Slack's motor car positioned outside the village hall like a monument to premature conviction. The day's dramatic developments began when Mrs. Jameson arrived breathless with news that would have sealed the Blackwood's fate in any ordinary investigation. The police had searched Greenways at first light, she reported with barely contained excitement, and a bottle of digitalis tincture had been discovered in Mrs. Blackwood's bedside cabinet. Inspector Slack, with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had finally found physical confirmation, was preparing to make arrests before noon. Miss Marple listened to this revelation with the gentle attention she gave to all household announcements, though her experienced eye detected the particular flaws that marked planted evidence. When she examined the scene at Greenways under the pretense of offering neighborly support, the details spoke volumes to someone trained in observing human nature. The bottle sat in a drawer where dust patterns revealed its recent placement. Its cork was too new for medicine that should have been acquired weeks earlier, and the label bore the distinctive diagonal tick of a man who trimmed labels with small scissors kept to the right of his desk. Mrs. Blackwood's distress appeared genuine, as she insisted she had never seen the bottle before, and her husband's demand for a solicitor carried the ring of innocent outrage rather than calculated desperation. Miss Marple noted how Inspector Slack's certainty had blinded him to these subtle but telling inconsistencies, his satisfaction with obvious suspects preventing him from questioning why guilty parties would keep incriminating evidence in such an easily discovered location. The investigation's direction shifted dramatically when Mrs. Bantry arrived with information from her London cousin that cast the entire case in a new light. The people calling themselves Blackwood were actually named Morrison, she revealed breathlessly, and they were fleeing from creditors after a business failure rather than hiding criminal activities. The registered letter that had caused such concern was from a London solicitor offering to negotiate a settlement of their debts, not evidence of some darker secret requiring murder to conceal. This revelation transformed the missing postal correspondence from evidence of guilt into proof of innocence. If the Morrisons had been expecting news about debt negotiations, they would have had no reason to murder the postman who was investigating their identities. Indeed, his death would only have drawn the kind of official attention they were desperately trying to avoid while living quietly under assumed names. Miss Marple absorbed this information while considering its implications for the case against Dr. Haydock, whose guilt became even more apparent with the elimination of the obvious suspect's motive. The physician's access to the murder weapon, his confrontation with the victim about intercepted correspondence, and his desperate attempts to remove evidence now stood in stark relief against the backdrop of the Morrisons' relative innocence. The morning's revelations continued when Miss Weatherby arrived with testimony that provided crucial evidence of premeditation. Her careful review of the library's borrowing records revealed that Dr. Haydock had requested several books about botanical poisons 3 weeks before the garden party, specifically texts about digitalist preparation and historical cases of foxglove poisoning. He had returned them the day after Postlethwaite's death, claiming his research was complete. Young Constable Polk's arrival brought confirmation of Inspector Slack's intentions to arrest the Morrisons that afternoon, despite the mounting inconsistencies in the evidence against them. His honest face showed the troubled expression of a man whose instincts told him something was wrong with the official conclusion, though his position prevented him from challenging his superior's judgment directly. Miss Marple recognized that the time had come for decisive intervention to prevent a grave miscarriage of justice. Her plan, formed during careful consideration of Dr. Haydock's psychological profile, required delicate orchestration to create circumstances that would force him to reveal his guilt through his own desperate actions rather than mere accusation. The afternoon brought the first phase of her strategy when she encountered Dr. Haydock at the gate of Greenways, where his expression moved rapidly from surprise to professional warmth before settling into careful neutrality. His inquiry about the investigation carried the particular quality of someone seeking information rather than offering genuine assistance, and his reaction to her casual mention of the pond behind the vicarage revealed the telltale signs of guilty knowledge. "You must not let me detain you if you have patience, Doctor," Miss Marple observed gently. "Though I wonder whether that clever little boy was right who told me the pond behind the vicarage is very useful for cooling bottles in summer. Boys do say such odd things." For the space of a heartbeat, something in Dr. Haydock's carefully composed expression ceased to be under control. His eyes narrowed as though answering a question posed in a language he preferred not to speak, before the professional mask reasserted itself, and he dismissed the comment as childish nonsense. Miss Marple's morning investigations had also revealed the full extent of Dr. Haydock's methodical approach to eliminating evidence. Mrs. Archer's confirmation about the distinctive brown sugar lump, combined with Hilda's testimony about the missing digitalis tincture and the physician's gathering of fresh foxglove flowers on the morning of the murder, created an overwhelming pattern of guilt that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The challenge now lay in presenting this evidence to Inspector Slack in a manner that would overcome his satisfaction with the obvious suspects and force him to consider the more complex but compelling case against the village's respected physician. Miss Marple's plan required patience and careful timing, for in her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed their professional standing made them above suspicion. As evening approached, she reflected on the psychology of the crime, recognizing the particular arrogance that would drive someone to use their own distinctive medical supplies as murder weapons while attempting to frame convenient suspects. Dr. Haydock's calculated method demonstrated not only premeditation, but the kind of intellectual pride that often proved the downfall of educated criminals who believed they could outwit both their victims and the authorities. The postman who had spoken too much had indeed discovered dangerous secrets about medical malpractice and professional misconduct, secrets that threatened not only Dr. Haydock's reputation, but his freedom and livelihood. Tomorrow would bring the crucial confrontation that would expose the truth, but tonight belonged to final preparations for the psychological trap that would force the real murderer to reveal himself through his own desperate actions when faced with the possibility of exposure. The village of St. Mary Mead slept uneasily, unaware that its trusted physician had already committed one murder to protect his secrets and might well be driven to further desperate acts if he realized that his carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel under the patient observation of an elderly lady whose understanding of human nature had been honed by decades of quiet watchfulness. The morning brought with it that peculiar quality of calculated calm that precedes decisive action, when ordinary events acquire heightened significance and every carefully chosen word carries the potential for revelation or catastrophe. Miss Marple, rising earlier than her customary hour, had spent the quiet pre-dawn moments arranging the psychological trap that would either expose Dr. Haydock's guilt or confirm his innocence through his own reactions to carefully orchestrated pressure. Her strategy began with a seemingly innocent encounter at the post office, where she arrived precisely when she knew Dr. Haydock would be collecting his morning correspondence. Young Daisy Rudkin, having been gently coached in her role, provided the opening gambit with nervous but determined cooperation. "Oh, Miss Marple," Daisy announced with theatrical concern, her voice pitched to carry exactly the right distance. "Inspector Slack was so pleased when you brought him that bottle young Tommy found in the pond. He says the laboratory can tell exactly what was mixed with the elderflower cordial, even after being in the water. Something about residue patterns that don't wash away." Miss Marple observed Dr. Haydock's reaction with the careful attention she reserved for moments of particular significance. His hands, reaching for his letters, paused almost imperceptibly, and something in his carefully composed expression shifted before he recovered his professional demeanor. The seed of anxiety had been planted, and she noted how he departed the post office with unusual haste, claiming urgent medical appointments that required his immediate attention. The second phase of her orchestration involved Mrs. Weatherby at the lending library, where their conversation was conducted with the windows open to the street and Dr. Haydock's surgery clearly visible across the lane. Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe the physician's consulting room window, noting how his attention focused on their discussion with the particular intensity of someone whose peace of mind depended on knowing exactly what was being said about him. "I've been thinking about those botanical texts Dr. Haydock borrowed," Miss Weatherby announced with carefully rehearsed concern, "particularly the one with detailed instructions for preparing concentrated digitalis extract from fresh foxglove flowers. There were extensive notes in the margins, written in what appeared to be medical handwriting." Through the surgery window, Miss Marple observed Dr. Haydock's figure stiffen, his attention riveted on their conversation despite his pretense of examining patient files. When Mrs. Weatherby continued her performance by mentioning the careful records kept of library borrowers, the physician's agitation became even more apparent in the way he moved restlessly about his consulting room. The afternoon brought the culmination of Miss Marple's carefully laid plan, a reconstruction tea party at the vicarage, ostensibly to help clarify memories and timelines for Inspector Slack's final report. The drawing room had been restored to its previous arrangement, with Mrs. Archer's flowered tea service positioned exactly as it had been during the fatal garden party. Most significantly, Miss Marple had requested Mrs. Archer to bring one of Dr. Haydock's distinctive brown medical sugar lumps, which now sat conspicuously among the white granulated sugar in the serving bowl. The assembled company included all the principal figures from the original tragedy: the Morrisons, looking relieved but still wary; Mrs. Archer and Hilda, nervous but determined to see justice done; Miss Weatherby, pale but resolute; and Dr. Haydock himself, arriving with forced punctuality and a carefully maintained professional demeanor that did not quite conceal the strain he had been under. "One so hates to confuse the memory," Miss Marple murmured as she arranged the tea service with precise attention to detail. "I thought it might be helpful to recreate the exact circumstances, just to ensure we have everything quite clear." Inspector Slack, having been persuaded to allow this unconventional approach, positioned himself where he could observe both the proceedings and the vicar's study. where certain documents had been strategically placed as additional bait for anyone desperate enough to attempt tampering with evidence. As tea was served and the conversation turned to the events of the fatal afternoon, Miss Marple began her gentle but relentless psychological pressure. She noted how Dr. Haydock's gaze repeatedly found the distinctive brown sugar lump in the bowl, his eyes darting away each time as though scalded by the sight. "I always think elderflower has such a persistent scent," Miss Marple observed mildly, touching the spoon she had used to handle the recovered bottle. "It clings to one's fingers in the most remarkable way, doesn't it, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock's response was involuntary, but telling. His hand moved unconsciously to rub his thumb against his forefinger, a small but betraying echo of her gesture that revealed guilty knowledge of handling the poisoned cordial bottle. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple asked those who had served refreshments to demonstrate their exact positions and procedures from the fatal afternoon. As Hilda placed the sugar bowl in its precise location, the single brown medical lump caught the afternoon light like an accusation, its distinctive appearance declaring itself unmistakably different from ordinary sugar. How thoughtful of whoever borrowed the vicar's desk key to try to tidy up afterward, Miss Marple continued with deceptive gentleness. "One so often forgets to return things when one is busy with more pressing concerns." The effect on Dr. Haydock was immediate and damning. His carefully composed expression compressed with barely controlled anxiety, and his gaze moved involuntarily toward the study before he caught himself, the very attempt to avoid looking serving as confirmation of guilty knowledge. Inspector Slack, recognizing his cue, strolled with affected casualness toward the passage leading to the vicar's study, positioning himself where he could observe any attempt to tamper with the strategically placed documents. "I should think," Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness, "that those papers would be of interest only to someone with particular professional concerns. Letters do have such an awkward way of arriving whether one wishes them to or not." The vicarage clock ticked with deliberate precision as Dr. Haydock struggled visibly with the psychological trap closing around him. His professional composure, maintained through years of respected practice, began to crack under the accumulated pressure of evidence, suspicion, and his own guilty conscience. "I'm afraid I must telephone the surgery," he announced with forced calm, rising abruptly from his chair. "A patient matter requires immediate attention." "Of course," Miss Marple replied gently, her gaze resting meaningfully on his hands. "I do hope you won't find the study telephone as troublesome as the tea service was yesterday. Some substances can be so very persistent." He moved toward the study with that brisk, economical stride that had once carried such professional authority, but Inspector Slack and Constable Pork were ready. The sounds that followed told their own story. A drawer that resisted opening because someone expected it to contain something it no longer held. The telltale clink of metal on wood as scissors were hastily set down, and the crisp, betraying rustle of papers being examined with desperate urgency. When Dr. Haydock returned to the drawing room with Inspector Slack, his carefully maintained facade had cracked beyond repair. His face was flushed with the particular combination of guilt, fear, and desperate calculation that marked a man whose carefully laid plans had been systematically destroyed by patient observation and psychological insight. "I was merely attempting to organize the vicar's papers," he began with forced authority, but his voice carried none of its usual conviction. "How very considerate," Miss Marple agreed with gentle irony. "Just as considerate as disposing of a troublesome bottle in the pond, or replacing a depleted digitalis tincture with harmless liquid to avoid awkward questions about missing controlled substances." The assembled company absorbed her words with varying degrees of understanding, but Dr. Haydock's reaction provided all the confirmation necessary. His eyes moved involuntarily to the elderflower bottle on Inspector Slack's table, then away again too late to conceal his recognition of the evidence that would ultimately convict him. "The thing about human nature," Miss Marple observed with the gentle persistence that had served her so well in previous investigations, is that people cannot help revealing themselves through the small, unconscious things they do. The hand that remembers the feel of sticky glass, the eye that recognizes sugar not its own, the mind that cannot leave papers undisturbed when it fears what they might reveal. Dr. Haydock stared at her then with the dawning realization that his carefully constructed deception had been unraveled not by forensic science or official investigation, but by the patient observation of an elderly lady whose understanding of human psychology had proven more penetrating than his own estimation of his cleverness. For a long moment, the respected village physician seemed to consider some final desperate denial or explanation, but the accumulated weight of evidence, psychological pressure, and his own betraying reactions had made further deception impossible. With a gesture that seemed to encompass both defeat and relief, he slowly sat back down, his professional authority finally abandoned in the face of inexorable truth. The confession, when it came, would be formal and detailed, but the real revelation had already occurred in the quiet drawing room, where Miss Marple's gentle but relentless understanding of human nature had exposed the dangerous arrogance of someone who had believed his professional standing made him above suspicion. The postman, who had spoken too much, had indeed discovered secrets worth killing for, but those secrets had ultimately been revealed not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient observation of the small, telling details that revealed the truth about people's hearts. The silence that followed Dr. Haydock's collapse into his chair stretched through the vicarage drawing room like a held breath, heavy with the weight of revelation and the peculiar quality that comes when long-hidden truths finally surface into daylight. Miss Marple continued her gentle knitting, her pale blue eyes moving with quiet assessment over the assembled faces, noting how each person absorbed the implications of what they had witnessed with varying degrees of shock, understanding, and relief. Inspector Slack, his earlier confidence in the Morrisons' guilt now transformed into the uncomfortable awareness that his investigation had nearly resulted in a grave miscarriage of justice, positioned himself with careful deliberation near the door while recognizing that the true revelation would come not from official interrogation, but from the elderly lady whose understanding of human nature had proven more penetrating than forensic science. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested with characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying that particular quality of patient authority that had served her so well throughout the investigation, it would be helpful if we reviewed exactly how poor Mr. Postlethwaite came to discover the dangerous secrets that cost him his life. Dr. Haydock raised his head with visible effort, his weathered face bearing the exhausted expression of a man whose carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed beyond repair. The professional mask that had served him so well throughout his career had cracked irreparably, revealing the desperate fear and guilty knowledge that lay beneath his respected exterior. Miss Marple's explanation unfolded with the same methodical precision that had characterized her investigation, each piece of evidence fitting into place with inexorable logic. The postman's discovery had begun innocently enough with his natural curiosity about the Morrisons' mysterious correspondence. But his investigation had led him down a far more dangerous path when he noticed the tampered registered letter addressed to Dr. Haydock. "The thing about Mr. Postlethwaite," Miss Marple observed with gentle sadness, "was that despite his unfortunate tendency toward gossip, he possessed a genuine sense of justice. When he discovered that letter from the General Medical Council regarding allegations of professional misconduct, he felt compelled to investigate further. His copying of the correspondence using the library's equipment revealed a pattern of questionable prescribing practices and patient deaths that warranted official scrutiny. The murder method itself demonstrated the particular combination of medical knowledge and desperate calculation that had driven Dr. Haydock to his fatal decision. The digitalis poisoning had been accomplished using the physician's own distinctive medical supplies. Brown sugar lumps, specially prepared for diabetic patients, designed to dissolve slowly and deliver concentrated doses of medication. Dr. Haydock knew that ordinary sugar could not guarantee the victim would consume a fatal dose. Miss Marple explained with quiet precision. Mr. Postlethwaite's recent reduction in sugar intake, advised by the doctor himself for stomach troubles, meant that relying on multiple poisoned lumps would be unreliable. So a single, concentrated dose was prepared using a medical sugar lump saturated with digitalis extract. The elderflower cordial bottle that had gone missing during the garden party served a crucial purpose in the murder scheme. Its sweet, distinctive flavor provided the perfect mask for digitalis's naturally bitter taste, ensuring that the victim would not detect the poison until it was too late. The sticky residue found on the broken teacup fragments, the traces of elderflower in the pond where the bottle was hastily discarded, and the bees that had fussed industriously at the spilled mixture in the grass all provided physical confirmation of this method. The missing saucer from Mrs. Archer's tea service was equally significant, Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm as she spoke. It had been used to transport the prepared sugar lump to the refreshment tent, and its removal eliminated any traces of the poison preparation that might have clung to its surface. Dr. Haydock's systematic attempt to eliminate evidence revealed both the premeditation of his crime and the particular arrogance that had ultimately led to his exposure. The theft of carbon paper from the library, the hiding of Postlethwaite's postal pouch in the post office storage room, and the planting of digitalis tincture in the Morrisons' bedroom all demonstrated a methodical approach to misdirection that had nearly succeeded. The planted evidence at Greenways was particularly revealing, Miss Marple noted with gentle irony. The dust patterns around the bottles showed it had been placed recently. The cork was too new for medicine that should have been acquired weeks earlier, and the label bore the distinctive diagonal trim of someone who kept small scissors to the right of his desk. When Inspector Slack's formal questioning began, Dr. Haydock's confession emerged with the weary precision of a man who had finally accepted the inevitable. His voice, stripped of its usual professional authority, revealed how financial pressure following unwise investments had led him to exploit his trusted position, charging wealthy patients for unnecessary treatments, while prolonging their conditions to maximize profit. The General Medical Council's investigation threatened everything, he admitted with hollow resignation. Not just my practice and reputation, but criminal charges for the deaths of patients who had trusted me with their lives. Postlethwaite's determination to expose the truth made him a danger I could not ignore. The confrontation with the postman on Tuesday afternoon had confirmed Dr. Haydock's worst fears. Postlethwaite had waved the intercepted correspondence with righteous indignation, declaring that doctors who took advantage of sick people deserved to face justice regardless of their standing in the community. The physician's attempts to intimidate or reason with him had failed completely, leaving murder as the only solution he could envision. I prepared the poisoned sugar lump that evening, Dr. Haydock continued, his professional training evident even in confession as he described the precise calculation of dosage required to cause rapid cardiac arrest. The elderflower cordial was stolen during the garden party setup, when everyone was busy with arrangements, and no one noticed an extra bottle disappearing from Mrs. Archer's supplies. The actual administration of the poison had been accomplished with chilling simplicity. When Mrs. Morrison requested water and young Hilda left the refreshment tent to fetch it, Dr. Haydock had stepped through the side entrance under the pretense of observing how the ladies managed their arrangements. The poisoned sugar lump, carried in a twist of paper in his pocket, had been dropped among the ordinary lumps in the serving bowl with practiced medical precision. I watched him take up the tongs and make one of his little jokes, Dr. Haydock recalled with grim satisfaction at his thoroughness. 2 for luck, he said, even though he only took 1 lump as he had for months. But it didn't matter. That single lump contained enough digitalis, sir, to kill him regardless of his actual consumption habits. The aftermath had required equally methodical attention to detail. During the confusion following Postlethwaite's collapse, Dr. Haydock had removed the postal pouch from the vicarage cloakroom and later hidden it in the post office storage room, accessing the building through the unlocked side door while Daisy was upstairs. The elderflower bottle had been thrown into the vicarage pond under cover of darkness, where it would have remained hidden if not for young Tommy's fishing expedition. The planted evidence at the Morrisons' house was a desperate measure, he admitted with the bitter honesty of complete defeat. When Inspector Slack announced the morning search, I panicked and tried to buy safety with another deception. I had access to their home during a supposed medical emergency, and used it to place the digitalis bottle where it would be easily discovered. Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable questioning revealed the full psychological dimension of the crime, exposing how Dr. Haydick's gradual moral corruption had made murder seem like merely another adjustment of ethical boundaries. His exploitation of wealthy patients had begun as minor accommodations for discretion and evolved into systematic fraud that ultimately required violence to conceal. "The thing about human nature," Miss Marple observed with characteristic insight, "is that people cannot help revealing themselves through their actions, no matter how carefully they plan their deceptions. Your use of your own medical supplies as murder weapons, Dr. Haydick, demonstrated the particular arrogance that often proves the downfall of intelligent criminals who believe their professional standing makes them above suspicion." As Inspector Slack prepared the formal arrest procedures, the vicarage drawing room settled into the profound quiet that follows dramatic revelations. Mrs. Archer removed the remaining brown sugar lump from her serving bowl with decisive finality, dropping it into the fire where it hissed and dissolved like the physician's carefully constructed respectability. The Morrisons, no longer burdened with false identities or suspicion of murder, faced their financial difficulties with something approaching relief that their worst deception had been mere embarrassment rather than violence. The afternoon light was fading through the vicarage windows as Dr. Haydick was led away, his figure diminished by the weight of confession and the knowledge that his trusted position in the community had been perverted to deadly purpose. The village of St. Mary Mead would require time to absorb the shock of discovering that their respected physician had been their most dangerous resident, and that the postman who had spoken too much had paid with his life for his determination to see justice done. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction, reflecting on how the most shocking crimes often sprang from the most ordinary circumstances, requiring nothing more than patient observation of human nature to reveal the truth that lay hidden beneath respectable facades. The case was closed, but the lessons it taught about the corruption of trust and the importance of moral courage would linger long after the official proceedings were complete. The evening that followed Dr. Haydick's confession settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar quality of exhausted relief that comes when a long-held tension finally releases, leaving the village to absorb the profound implications of what had been revealed in the quiet sanctuary of the vicarage drawing room. Miss Marple, having declined Inspector Slack's offer of transportation, walked slowly through the familiar lanes as September twilight gathered around her, noting how the ordinary sounds of evening had acquired a different character now that the shadow of unsolved murder no longer lay across the community. Inspector Slack departed with obvious satisfaction at the case's resolution, though his earlier confidence in the Morrisons' guilt had been tempered by the uncomfortable recognition that his investigation had nearly resulted in a grave miscarriage of justice. His final words to Miss Marple carried both gratitude and a grudging admission that her understanding of human psychology had proven more penetrating than conventional police methods. The formal proceedings that followed were swift and methodical, with Dr. Haydick's detailed confession corroborated by the mounting physical evidence that Miss Marple's patient observation had brought to light. Within days, a thorough search of the surgery and Dr. Haydick's residence yielded exactly what Miss Marple had expected. The missing saucer from Mrs. Archer's tea service, wrapped in old newspaper and hidden behind a box of unused syringes. A small packet of the distinctive brown medical sugar lumps, one bearing the telltale darkened edges of some sticky infusion, and in his desk drawer, carefully labeled samples of foxglove tincture prepared according to notes written in a hand that wavered only when fatigue had loosened his usual precision. The elderflower bottle, retrieved from the vicarage pond by young Tommy's fishing expedition, yielded traces of digitalis that confirmed the murder method even after its soaking in muddy water. The Morrisons, now revealed as the debt-fleeing couple they truly were, received Inspector Slack's formal apology with dignity tempered by visible relief. Their deception, while regrettable, had been born of financial embarrassment rather than criminal intent, making them victims of circumstance who had narrowly escaped becoming scapegoats for a far more calculated crime. Mrs. Morrison's tears at the vicarage, when the vicar offered assistance in contacting their proper solicitor, spoke to the genuine gratitude of people who had faced the specter of execution for crimes they could never have committed. The village itself seemed to exhale collectively as word of the truth spread through the community with that particular swiftness that shocking revelations acquire in small places. Miss Marple observed how neighbors emerged from their cottages to discuss the day's events in hushed tones, their conversations carrying that mixture of horror and fascination that follows the exposure of long-hidden corruption among familiar faces. Mrs. Bantry, appearing at her garden gate with inevitable urgency, provided the first indication of how profoundly the community struggled to reconcile their trust with the reality of Dr. Haydock's crimes. "To think we all trusted him with our health and our lives," Mrs. Bantry murmured with genuine distress, her hands fluttering nervously at her pearls. "All those times he attended our ailments, delivered our children, comforted our elderly. It makes one question everything one thought one knew about human nature." Young Daisy Rudkin, still trembling from her crucial role in exposing the truth, found herself a reluctant local hero whose quiet observations had proven more potent than she could have imagined. Mrs. Archer, who had known the doctor since his boyhood, struggled visibly to reconcile the image of the kind family physician with the calculating poisoner who had perverted his medical knowledge to deadly purpose. Even the children, with their characteristic resilience, soon returned to their games, though their whispered references to Dr. Haydock's poison would occasionally drift across the village green as a reminder of innocence touched by adult corruption. Miss Weatherby's visit brought particular poignancy to the evening's reflections, as she confided her distress about the botanical texts Dr. Haydock had borrowed from her library. "To think he was using our resources to research methods of murder while maintaining his facade as a respected physician," she said with visible anguish. "It makes one feel complicit somehow, even though we had no knowledge of his intentions." The moral dimensions of the case weighed heavily on Miss Marple's thoughts as she settled into her comfortable sitting room for the evening's final reflections. Postlethwaite's death had resulted from his determination to expose wrongdoing, transforming him from village busybody to moral crusader who had paid with his life for his sense of justice. Dr. Haydock's gradual corruption, from minor ethical accommodations to systematic fraud and finally calculated murder, demonstrated how professional respectability could mask the most dangerous criminal minds. The method of the crime itself revealed the particular arrogance of intelligent criminals who believed their social standing made them above suspicion. His use of distinctive medical supplies as murder weapons, the precise calculation of digitalis dosage, and the systematic elimination of evidence showed how professional knowledge could be perverted to deadly purpose when moral constraints were abandoned for self-preservation. As autumn deepened around St. Mary Mead in the weeks that followed, life gradually resumed its familiar rhythms, though with subtle changes that spoke to the community's hard-won wisdom. A new wariness had settled upon the villagers, a quiet understanding that even the most respectable facades could conceal chilling darkness. Conversations that had once flowed freely now sometimes carried unspoken questions about what secrets might lie beneath familiar surfaces. Miss Marple, observing these changes from her garden as the leaves turned to russet and gold, recognized that this unease would linger, but eventually heal. The village would recover, as communities always did, but it would never quite forget the postman who spoke too much and the trusted doctor who had believed himself above the reach of truth. Human nature, she reflected as her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, remained an infinitely complex landscape where light and shadow intertwined in patterns that required patient observation to understand. The baby booty in her lap, now nearly complete, represented hopeful innocence in stark contrast to the darkness recently exposed. The case was closed, justice served, but its lessons about trust, corruption, and moral courage would continue to resonate long after the official proceedings concluded. In the end, truth had prevailed not through dramatic revelation, but through careful attention to the small, telling details that revealed the reality of people's characters beneath their carefully constructed masks. The postman, who had spoken too much, had finally received the vindication he deserved, and the dangerous secrets he had died to expose were now safely in the hands of proper authorities. St. Mary Mead would heal from this wound to its collective trust, but it would emerge stronger and wiser, having learned that vigilance and understanding remained essential guardians against the darker impulses that could corrupt even the most respected members of their peaceful community. The weeks that followed Dr. Haydock's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead that peculiar quality of gradual healing that marks communities touched by profound betrayal, where ordinary routines slowly reassert themselves while carrying the subtle weight of hard-won wisdom. Miss Marple, observing the village's recovery from her garden as October painted the hedgerows in shades of amber and crimson, noted how the residents had begun to emerge from their initial shock with that characteristic resilience that defines small communities faced with the unthinkable. The trial at the county courthouse drew considerable attention from the London press, transforming the quiet village into a temporary focal point of national interest in medical ethics and professional corruption. Dr. Haydock's conviction on charges of murder and medical malpractice carried a sentence that reflected both the gravity of his crimes and the particular betrayal of professional trust they represented. Miss Marple, called upon to testify about her observations, maintained her characteristic composure throughout the proceedings, though she privately regretted how sensational journalism transformed complex moral questions into simplified narratives of good and evil. Inspector Slack departed with obvious satisfaction at the case's resolution, though his earlier confidence in the Morrisons' guilt had been tempered by the uncomfortable recognition that his investigation had nearly resulted in a grave miscarriage of justice. His final words to Miss Marple carried both gratitude and a grudging admission that her understanding of human psychology had proven more penetrating than conventional police methods. The village's reaction to Dr. Haydock's downfall proved complex and multifaceted. There was anger, certainly, at the betrayal of trust, particularly from those who had placed their health and their secrets in his care. But there was also a profound sense of loss for the man they had believed him to be, the kind physician who had delivered generations of their children and comforted them in times of illness. Mrs. Bantry, appearing frequently at Miss Marple's gate with bewildered questions, struggled to reconcile the image of the benevolent doctor with the calculating murderer. "How could we never have seen it, Jane?" she would ask, her voice carrying that particular note of shaken confidence that follows the exposure of long-held deceptions. Young Daisy Rudkin, whose crucial testimony about the missing postal pouch had provided key evidence in the case, found herself struggling with unwanted prominence. The shy girl who had simply been doing her job now carried the burden of having been instrumental in exposing a murderer, and Miss Marple noted how she often kept her gaze fixed on her sorting tray, avoiding the curious eyes that followed her. Mrs. Archer, recognizing the girl's distress, took particular care to include her in the village's social fabric, understanding that heroes, especially reluctant ones, required gentle nurturing. The Morrisons, no longer burdened by false identities or suspicion of murder, had chosen to remain in St. Mary Mead despite the painful associations their residents now carried. Their decision to face their financial difficulties openly, with assistance from the vicar and several community members, had gradually transformed them from mysterious outsiders into neighbors whose struggles were understood and supported. Mrs. Morrison's work in the village school and her husband's assistance with various community projects began weaving them into the social fabric with genuine acceptance rather than suspicious tolerance. The memorial service for Reginald Postlethwaite, held on a crisp November morning when frost silvered the churchyard grass, brought together the entire community in recognition of a man whose flaws had been overshadowed by his final act of moral courage. The vicar's eulogy carefully balanced acknowledgement of the postman's unfortunate tendency toward gossip with appreciation for his genuine concern for justice, transforming him from village busybody into reluctant hero whose death had exposed corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. It was during the clearing of Mr. Postlethwaite's belongings that Mrs. Finch made a discovery that provided both closure and vindication for the deceased postman. In his writing desk, under a collection of postcards and railway timetables, lay a brown paper parcel already stamped and addressed to the General Medical Council. Inside were the copies he had made at the library, accompanied by a covering note apologizing for his temerity but insisting upon his duty to expose wrongdoing. Miss Marple, summoned by Mrs. Finch's nervous knock, recognized both the parcel's importance and its pathos, walking it personally to the post office where Daisy accepted it with the solemnity of one handling a fallen comrade's final testament. The arrival of Dr. Pemberton from the neighboring village to take over the practice brought both relief and a certain wariness that spoke to the community's altered relationship with trust. The new physician, a younger man with earnest manners and impeccable credentials, found himself subjected to scrutiny that would have been unthinkable before the revelation of his predecessor's crimes. Conversations that had once been taken at face value now sometimes carried subtle undercurrents of evaluation, as people had learned to look more carefully beneath surface appearances. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead with its familiar rhythms of shortened days and longer evenings by the fire, Miss Marple found herself increasingly sought out by neighbors who had come to appreciate her unique insights into human nature. The village had acquired a different quality in the months following the case's resolution, with residents displaying both greater wariness and deeper appreciation for the genuine kindness and integrity that characterized most of their neighbors. The approach of Christmas brought annual preparations that carried additional significance as symbols of renewal and hope. The Christmas bazaar, traditionally held in the vicarage hall, would proceed as planned, despite painful memories associated with the location, representing the community's determination not to let tragedy destroy cherished traditions. Miss Marple, accepting Mrs. Bantry's invitation to help organize decorations, recognized the healing power of familiar rituals performed in the company of trusted friends. Young Tommy Bond, who had discovered the crucial elderflower bottle, continued his adventures by the vicarage pond, though now with new respect for its murky depths. The discarded bottle, transformed from simple litter into evidence of murder, had changed the pond from a fishing spot into a place touched by life's darker currents. It was a subtle transformation, yet significant, reflecting how the village's innocence had been irrevocably altered. Miss Marple reflected on how the case had revealed not only the specific crimes of one corrupted individual, but broader questions about trust, authority, and moral responsibility that affected every aspect of village life. The investigation had ripped away the comfortable illusion of St. Mary Mead as a place where such darkness could not exist, forcing inhabitants to acknowledge the capacity for evil even within their most trusted circles. This understanding, though unsettling, was ultimately a necessary step toward a more mature and resilient sense of community. The baby booty she had been knitting throughout the investigation was finally complete, its tiny perfection a testament to patient craftsmanship and hopeful purpose. Mrs. Clement's new daughter, born just as the legal proceedings concluded, would grow up in a community that had learned hard lessons about the importance of vigilance and the courage required to question authority when circumstances demanded it. As the first snow of winter began to fall beyond her sitting-room window, Miss Marple took up her knitting once again, beginning a simple shawl in soft grey that reminded her of doves. The case of the postman who spoke too much had reached its official conclusion, but its deeper lessons about human nature, moral courage, and the importance of community vigilance would continue to influence St. Mary Mead for years to come. The village had survived its encounter with calculated evil and emerged stronger, wiser, and more appreciative of the genuine goodness that flourished when ordinary people chose to act with integrity and compassion. The postman's sacrifice had not been in vain, and the community he had died to protect would honor his memory by maintaining the vigilance necessary to preserve both justice and compassion in their peaceful corner of the world. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer of human nature's eternal drama, understood that while wickedness would always exist, so too would the quiet heroism of those who chose to stand against it, one small act of courage at a time. The spring that followed brought to St. Mary Mead that gentle quality of renewal that marks communities which have weathered profound trials, and emerged with deeper understanding of both human frailty and the quiet heroism that often lies dormant in ordinary hearts. Miss Marple, sitting in her garden on a particularly fine May morning 6 months after Dr. Haydock's conviction, observed how the village had settled into rhythms that acknowledged both the lessons learned and the essential goodness that had ultimately prevailed over calculated evil. The cherry tree beside her cottage gate had burst into magnificent bloom, its white petals drifting like benedictions across the path, where Mr. Postlethwaite had once walked with such purposeful energy, his leather pouch swinging at his side as he carried the village's correspondence with meticulous care. The new postman, a quiet young man named Williams, had gradually won acceptance through his professional discretion and genuine kindness, though Miss Marple noted how residents now collected their mail with subtle attention to details they had previously taken for granted. The memorial service held for Reginald Postlethwaite on the anniversary of his death had been a moment of profound significance for the community. The simple stone placed in the churchyard bore the inscription, "He spoke for justice," transforming the village busybody into a reluctant hero whose unfortunate tendency toward gossip had ultimately served a higher purpose. Mrs. Finch, his former landlady, had presented the village with his final, undelivered parcel to the General Medical Council, which now rested in a place of honor in the vicarage, a testament to his determination to see wrongdoing exposed regardless of personal cost. Dr. Pemberton's integration into village life had proceeded with careful mutual evaluation, though Miss Marple was pleased to observe how his genuine dedication to his patients had gradually overcome the wariness that Dr. Haydock's betrayal had created. The new physician's practice of explaining his treatments in detail and encouraging patients to seek second opinions when desired represented a conscious effort to rebuild the trust that his predecessor had so thoroughly violated. His youth and earnest manner provided a sharp contrast to the calculating sophistication that had masked such dangerous corruption. The transformation of the Morrisons from suspected murderers to beloved community members represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the village's healing process. Their decision to renew their wedding vows in the village church, with the entire community as witnesses, had provided a powerful symbol of redemption and acceptance. Mrs. Morrison's work at the village school and her husband's assistance with various community projects had woven them into the social fabric with genuine affection rather than suspicious tolerance. Their journey from deception, born of desperation, to honest integration served as a powerful reminder that human nature, while complex, generally tended toward goodness when given opportunity and support. Young Daisy Rudkin, whose crucial observations had proven instrumental in exposing the truth, had grown visibly in confidence and responsibility. Her promotion to senior clerk at the post office, following recognition of her reliability and discretion, represented both personal advancement and the village's acknowledgement that heroism often resided in the most unassuming individuals. Mrs. Archer and her niece Hilda had returned to their customary roles with quiet dignity, their tea service once again a symbol of village hospitality rather than a backdrop for tragedy. The annual Harvest Festival, when it came round again in September, would be held once more on the vicarage lawn, though with subtle changes that reflected the community's hard-won wisdom. Additional oversight of refreshments, different positioning of the marquees, and a moment of silence for Mr. Postlethwaite would acknowledge both memory and vigilance. Miss Marple had accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to help with arrangements, understanding that returning to normal activities in the same location represented an important step in the community's complete healing. As evening settled over the village with its familiar sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting over garden gates, Miss Marple reflected on the complex lessons that the case had taught about human nature, professional responsibility, and moral courage. The investigation had revealed not only the specific crimes of one corrupted individual, but broader questions about trust, authority, and the vigilance required to maintain justice in even the most peaceful communities. The baby shawl she had completed during the long winter months now wrapped young Margaret Clement, whose first birthday had been celebrated with the particular joy that new life brings to communities touched by death. The child's innocent laughter, echoing across the village green, represented hope and continuity in the face of the darkness that had temporarily shadowed their peaceful corner of England. Mrs. Bantry's visit brought news of the final legal proceedings, which had concluded with Dr. Haydock's unsuccessful appeal and his continued imprisonment. The former physician's death in custody from natural causes, while tragic in its own way, had provided a kind of closure that allowed the village to move forward without the shadow of his eventual release. Even in his corruption, he had been a human being whose fall from grace carried elements of tragedy alongside justice, reminding Miss Marple that evil often emerged from weakness and pride rather than inherent wickedness. The postman who had spoken too much had indeed paid the ultimate price for his determination to expose wrongdoing, but his sacrifice had not been in vain. The community he had died to protect had emerged stronger, wiser, and more appreciative of the genuine goodness that flourished when ordinary people chose to act with integrity and compassion. The case was closed, justice served, but its deeper lessons about the importance of moral courage and community vigilance would continue to influence St. Mary Mead for generations to come. As the stars appeared in the deepening sky and the village settled into peaceful slumber, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more, beginning a new project with the patient precision that had served her so well throughout the investigation. The pattern required attention to detail, much like the puzzle of human nature itself, where small, seemingly insignificant elements often proved crucial to understanding the larger design. The case of the postman who spoke too much had reached its final resolution, but the story it told about the eternal struggle between good and evil, played out in the quiet drama of village life, would continue as long as human beings gathered in communities and faced the daily choice between selfishness and service, deception and truth, cowardice and courage. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer of this eternal drama, found comfort in knowing that while darkness would always threaten, the light of human decency would ultimately prevail, one small act of kindness and courage at a time. In the gentle rhythm of her knitting needles and the peaceful sounds of the village at rest, she found confirmation that ordinary life, with all its complexities and contradictions, remained the most extraordinary mystery of all. The truth, like a letter properly addressed and faithfully delivered, would always find its way to those with patience enough to wait and wisdom enough to recognize it when it arrived.